I was standing in the kitchen when my son Ethan walked in. That Tuesday afternoon, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, his expression carrying that particular blend of entitlement and expectation. I'd been watching grow stronger with each passing year. He dropped his bag on the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the silence between us, and without even looking at me directly, he said those words that would change everything. "You owe me everything, Mom," he announced, his voice carrying that casual certainty of someone who had never truly been told no, never really faced consequences, never understood what it meant to earn rather than receive. And in that moment, standing there with my hands still wet from washing dishes, I made a decision that would reshape our entire relationship. I let him believe it. I let him believe that, yes, I did owe him everything, that he was right, that the world revolved around his needs and wants and desires, and I watched as relief and satisfaction spread across his 17-year-old face because finally, his mother was admitting what he'd always known to be true. But here's what Ethan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand in that moment of his small victory. I wasn't agreeing with him because he was right. I was letting him believe it because I had finally reached the end of a very long road of patience, of second chances, of making excuses for behavior that had been spiraling out of control for years. I was letting him believe it because sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from argument or confrontation, but from allowing someone to walk so far down the wrong path that they finally see for themselves where it leads. My name is Caroline Mitchell. I'm 42 years old, and I had spent the last 17 years building a life for my son that I thought was filled with love and opportunity and everything a child could need to thrive. But somewhere along the way, between the private schools and the expensive sports equipment and the college fund, I'd sacrificed my own dreams to build. I had created something I never intended. I had created a child who believed the world owed him something, simply for existing. The journey to that kitchen confrontation had started years earlier, probably longer ago than I wanted to admit, even to myself. Ethan's father, Marcus, had left when our son was only 3 years old, disappearing into a new life with a woman he'd met at his office, leaving behind child support payments that came irregularly, at best, and birthday cards that eventually stopped coming at all. I had made a promise to myself in those early days of single motherhood that Ethan would never feel the absence of his father, that I would be enough for both of us, that he would never lack for anything that love and hard work could provide. I worked 2 jobs for years, pulling double shifts as a nurse at County General, while also doing private home care on my days off, building up savings, making sure Ethan had everything his friends had, and more. When he wanted guitar lessons, I found a way to pay for them. When he decided he wanted to play lacrosse, one of the most expensive youth sports imaginable, I picked up extra shifts and made it happen. When he asked for the latest gaming system, the newest phone, the brand name clothes that all his friends wore, I found ways to stretch my budget further than it should have logically gone. But with each gift, with each sacrifice I made to give him what he wanted, something shifted in our dynamic that I was too tired and too focused on just surviving to notice. Ethan stopped saying thank you somewhere around age 12. He stopped asking if we could afford things and started simply expecting them around age 14. By 16, he had developed a tone when speaking to me that my own mother would have corrected with a single look, a dismissive way of treating my efforts as though they were the bare minimum requirement, rather than the result of me working myself to exhaustion. His friends would come over and I'd overhear conversations where Ethan complained about things, about how we didn't have a pool like Jackson's family, about how our house was smaller than Madison's, about how my car was embarrassing, compared to what other parents drove, and each time I heard these complaints, something inside me would crack a little bit more. But I would tell myself that teenagers were just like that he was going through a phase, that eventually he would understand and appreciate everything I had done. The real breaking point had come 3 months before that kitchen confrontation, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Ethan had been accepted to several colleges, and we sat down together to look at the financial aid packages and discuss his options. I had saved nearly $60,000 for his education, a sum that had required sacrifices I never mentioned to him. Years of eating simple meals and wearing the same clothes and never taking vacations and driving a car that was perpetually on the edge of breaking down. It was a significant amount of money, but it wasn't enough to cover 4 years at the elite private university he had set his heart on, a school that would cost almost $80,000 per year. I explained this to him gently, showing him the numbers, suggesting he consider the state university where he'd also been accepted and where my savings would cover nearly his entire education, or perhaps one of the other private schools that had offered him more substantial scholarship packages. His reaction was something I still replay in my mind when I'm trying to fall asleep at night. Ethan looked at me with genuine shock, as though I had just told him I was planning to spend his college fund on a vacation to Europe for myself. "You're seriously telling me you can't afford to send me to Ashford?" he said, naming the prestigious private university, his voice rising with each word. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked to get in there? Do you know what this means for my future?" I tried to explain again about the finances, about the reality of what we could and couldn't afford, about how the state university had an excellent program in his intended major, and how he could still have an amazing education there. But he cut me off mid-sentence with words that still stung when I thought about them. "Other parents figure it out," he said coldly. "Jackson's parents are sending him to Dartmouth. Madison's parents are covering Yale. Why can't you just work harder, or get a better job, or do something, instead of holding me back?" I had stood there in stunned silence because this was my child, the baby I had rocked through countless sleepless nights, the toddler I had read bedtime stories to until my voice grew hoarse, the little boy who used to make me Mother's Day cards with crayon drawings of us holding hands under a smiling sun. And that child was now looking at me like I was an obstacle to his success, an inconvenience in his path to the life he felt entitled to live. I had opened my mouth to respond, to explain, to maybe finally tell him about the dinners I had skipped to save money, the nights I had worked until my feet bled in my nursing shoes, the social life I had sacrificed, the relationship opportunities I had passed up because I was too exhausted from working to provide for him. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the sudden realization that explaining wouldn't change anything, that he had somehow developed an inability to see me as a whole person with my own struggles and limitations, rather than just a resource that existed to serve his needs. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's attitude only intensified. He started making comments about how I didn't understand what it took to be successful in today's world, how I was settling for mediocrity by suggesting he attend a state school, how I clearly didn't believe in him enough to make his dreams happen. He would compare me unfavorably to his friends' parents, people who had careers I could never hope to match on a nurse's salary, people who had inherited family money or had 2 high-earning parents in the household. When I tried to have calm conversations about gratitude and realistic expectations, he would roll his eyes and retreat to his room, slamming the door in a way that somehow communicated both dismissal and disgust. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home, afraid to set him off, exhausted from work, and now emotionally exhausted from the constant tension with my only child. And then came that Tuesday afternoon, that moment in the kitchen when everything crystallized into a clarity I couldn't ignore anymore. Ethan had just been informed that afternoon that he had been awarded a small additional scholarship to Ashford, bringing the gap between what we had and what we needed down to about $10,000 per year. It was still money we didn't have, still an amount that would require me to take out loans or pick up even more work. But it was closer to possible than it had been before. He had come home excited, waving the letter, expecting me to immediately agree that now we could make it work. Now I could figure out how to cover that remaining gap. And when I had hesitated, when I had started to say that I needed to look at the numbers and think about what taking on that kind of debt would mean, that's when he had said it. "You owe me everything, Mom." Those words had hung in the air between us, and I had seen in his face that he genuinely believed them. Not as hyperbole, not as teenage exaggeration, but as fundamental truth. In Ethan's worldview, I owed him the college of his dreams, the life of his choosing, the future he had imagined for himself, and anything less than total support for his vision was a betrayal of my obligations as his mother. And that's when I made my decision. "You're right," I had said quietly, watching surprise flicker across his features. "You're absolutely right, Ethan. I do owe you everything." The relief and vindication on his face had been almost painful to witness. This child of mine, who had no idea what was actually happening in that moment. What I didn't tell him then, what I held back behind my calm agreement, was that I had finally understood something crucial. I had been so focused on giving Ethan everything that I had forgotten to teach him anything. I had provided for his wants while neglecting his character. I had sacrificed my own well-being to shield him from disappointment while failing to equip him with resilience. I had worked myself to the bone to hand him opportunities while never teaching him the value of working for them himself. And in doing so, I hadn't actually loved him well at all. I had created a person who would struggle in the real world, who would face crushing disappointment when he discovered that no one else was going to treat him as the center of the universe, who would blame others for his failures because he had never learned accountability. By letting him believe I owed him everything, I was actually beginning the process of teaching him the most important lesson he had somehow missed in 17 years of parenting. He owed himself everything. Over the next few days, I began implementing my plan, though Ethan had no idea what was actually unfolding. I maintained my agreement that yes, I owed him everything. I would give him everything. I would make Ashford happen. I told him we would find a way to cover that remaining gap, that I would make it work somehow, and I watched him accept this as his due rather than as an extraordinary sacrifice. But here's what I actually did. I made an appointment with a financial advisor I had been too overwhelmed to consult before, and together we looked at my actual financial picture with clear eyes. The truth was sobering. If I took on the debt necessary to cover Ethan's education at Ashford, I would be working well into my 70s to pay it off. I would have to eliminate any possibility of retirement, would have nothing left to cover my own potential medical needs or emergencies, would essentially be mortgaging my future to fund his present desires. The advisor, a kind woman named Patricia, who was probably close to my age, had looked at me across her desk and asked a question no one else had thought to ask. "Why?" she said simply. "Why would you do this to yourself?" And I had found myself without a good answer, beyond the circular logic that had trapped me for years. Because he's my son. Because that's what mothers do. Because I want him to have opportunities. Because I love him. Patricia had nodded slowly and then said something that shook me to my core. Caroline, in my 20 years doing this job, I've seen a lot of parents make financial decisions that hurt them to help their kids. And you know what I've noticed? The kids who appreciate it and make something of those opportunities are almost never the ones whose parents had to sacrifice everything to provide them. The ones who succeed are the ones who had to work for it themselves, who understood the value of what they were getting because they contributed to making it happen. I had left that appointment with a new perspective and a plan that felt both terrifying and liberating. I went home and I told Ethan that yes, we were going to make Ashford work, just like I had promised. The joy on his face was immediate and uncomplicated, the happiness of someone getting exactly what they wanted without any understanding of the cost. And then I told him the second part, the part that would change everything. "Here's how it's going to work," I said, maintaining the same calm tone I'd been using since our kitchen conversation. "The $60,000 I have saved will cover your first year completely, with some left over. For the remaining 3 years, you're going to need to figure out that $40,000 gap annually through a combination of additional scholarships, work study, student loans in your own name, and summer employment." The look of confusion on Ethan's face would have been comical if the moment hadn't been so serious. "What do you mean in my own name?" he said slowly, as though I was speaking another language. "Why would I take out loans when you can just work more?" And there it was, the fundamental disconnect laid bare. The assumption that my labor and my financial well-being were resources that existed primarily for his consumption. I took a deep breath and said words I should have said years earlier. "Because, Ethan, I've been thinking about what you said, about how I owe you everything, and you're right in a way you don't understand yet. I do owe you everything that a parent owes a child. I owe you love, which I've given you every single day of your life. I owe you safety and shelter, which I've provided even when it meant working myself to exhaustion. I owe you education, and I've given you 17 years of the best schooling I could afford, plus a college fund most kids would be incredibly grateful for. But you know what I don't owe you? I don't owe you the specific college of your dreams, regardless of the cost to my own future. I don't owe you a life without struggle or challenge or the need to work for what you want. I don't owe you the right to pursue your desires while I sacrifice my ability to ever retire or have security in my old age." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, and I watched Ethan's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been the first whisper of understanding, though it was quickly buried under defensiveness. "So, you're just going to let me down?" he said, his voice sharp. "After everything, after getting into Ashford, you're going to make me go to state because you won't help me?" I shook my head slowly and explained that no, he could absolutely go to Ashford if he wanted to, but he was going to have to want it enough to work for it, to apply for every scholarship available, to get a job and contribute to his own education, to understand that the privilege of attending an expensive private university came with responsibility. Or, I said quietly, you can accept the full ride you were offered at State, graduate with 0 debt, and have an excellent education that will serve you just as well in building the life you want. The choice is yours, Ethan. For the first time in a very long time, I'm letting you make the choice and live with the consequences. What followed were 3 of the most difficult weeks of my life, but also the most necessary. Ethan was furious, ranting to anyone who would listen about how unfair I was being, how other parents helped their kids, how I was sabotaging his future out of selfishness. He tried manipulation, switching between anger and tearful guilt-tripping, telling me I didn't love him, that I was punishing him for being ambitious, that I clearly resented his success. My resolve wavered more times than I could count because no parent wants to watch their child in distress, even when that distress is the result of facing reality for the first time. Friends questioned my decision. Other parents looked at me with judgment, suggesting I was being unnecessarily harsh or letting my own financial stress dictate choices that would impact Ethan's entire future. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was making a terrible mistake, if I was damaging our relationship beyond repair, if this was the right kind of tough love, or just cruelty disguised as a lesson. But I held firm, and slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. At first it was small changes. Ethan actually researching scholarships instead of just expecting me to figure everything out. Him asking questions about what I actually earned and what my financial situation looked like, rather than just assuming resources were limitless. He got a job at a local restaurant, something he had always refused before because he was too busy with school and activities. And I watched him come home tired from shifts and complain about difficult customers and suddenly speak with more respect about the work I did as a nurse, as though the experience of serving others and earning money had given him a new perspective on labor and value. He started looking more seriously at the state university option, visiting the campus again with what seemed like more open eyes, talking to students there about their experiences, realizing that his education and future success were going to depend more on his own effort and choices than on the name printed on his diploma. The real breakthrough came about 6 weeks after our kitchen confrontation, when Ethan came to me with a spreadsheet he had created, something I had never seen him do for anything related to school or planning before. He had calculated exactly what Ashford would cost over 4 years, what he could potentially earn from work-study and summer jobs, what scholarship opportunities he was applying for, and what the loan burden would look like upon graduation. And then he had done the same calculation for state, showing that he could graduate completely debt-free and even potentially have money left over from my original college fund that could be used for graduate school or a down payment on his first apartment. He looked at me with eyes that seemed older somehow, more serious, and said words I had been waiting years to hear. "I think I was wrong about some things, Mom. I think I maybe didn't understand how money actually works or how much you've done for me. It wasn't a complete transformation. Teenagers don't reverse 17 years of learned behavior in a few weeks. But it was a beginning. We talked that evening, really talked in a way we hadn't in years, about my financial situation and the sacrifices I had made and the reality of adult life that he was about to enter. I told him things I had kept from him before, about the nights I had worked double shifts and come home too exhausted to eat, about the times I had chosen between buying myself necessary items or putting more money in his college fund, about the relationships I had let fade because I had no time or energy for a social life while raising him alone. I wasn't trying to guilt him or make him feel bad. I was just finally being honest about the reality of our life instead of maintaining the illusion that everything came easily, that his opportunities appeared magically, without cost to anyone. Ethan made his decision 2 weeks before the college deadline, and it wasn't the one I had secretly been hoping for, but it wasn't the one I had feared either. He chose Ashford, but he chose it with his eyes open and with a plan that didn't require me to destroy my own financial future. He had cobbled together an additional $15,000 in scholarship money through applications he had submitted himself, had committed to work study that would cover about $8,000 per year, and had decided to take out student loans for the remaining gap in a combination of federal loans and private loans that he would be responsible for repaying. It meant he would graduate with about 60,000 in debt, a substantial amount but far from the crippling burden some students carried. And critically, it was his debt, his responsibility, his choice to take on because he valued the Ashford education enough to invest in it himself. The day he left for college, standing in the driveway loading boxes into my aging car for the drive to campus, Ethan turned to me with tears in his eyes and said something that made every difficult moment of the previous months worth it. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly, "for how I've been acting, for how I treated you, for not understanding what you were doing for me all these years. I still don't think I fully get it, but I'm starting to, and I promise I'm going to make the most of this opportunity. Not because I owe it to you, but because I owe it to myself." I had hugged him then, this boy who was becoming a man, and told him that was exactly what I had been hoping he would learn, that his life was his own to build, and that while I would always love him and support him, the responsibility for making something of his opportunities was on his shoulders now. The first semester was rocky. I won't pretend it wasn't. Ethan called home several times in those first few months, sometimes frustrated, sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes questioning whether he had made the right choice, and whether the work and the debt were going to be worth it. He struggled with balancing his work-study job with his coursework, complained about having less free time than his wealthier friends who didn't need to work, had moments of resentment that he couldn't afford to join some of the social activities that seemed effortless for other students. But something important was happening in those struggles. He was learning resilience, learning to manage his time, learning to make choices about what mattered most to him, learning that he was capable of more than he had given himself credit for when things had always been smoothed over for him. And something important was happening for me too, in my own life that had been on hold for so long. With Ethan at college and my finances no longer stretched past breaking point, I started attending to my own needs in ways I hadn't allowed myself to do for years. I joined a book club at the local library, something social and low-key that I could actually afford and commit to. I started taking better care of my health, making time for regular exercise and actual meals instead of eating whatever was quick and cheap. I even went on a few dates with a man named Robert, who worked in the hospital administration. Nothing serious yet, but the first time in years that I had allowed myself to think about my own romantic life as something that mattered. I was rediscovering who Caroline was outside of being Ethan's mother, outside of being the person who sacrificed everything for someone else. And it was both terrifying and exhilarating to realize that I was still young enough to have a future of my own. The real validation of the choices I had made came at the end of Ethan's first year, when he came home for summer break with a maturity I hadn't seen before and news that changed our dynamic even further. He had done well academically despite the challenges, had networked through his work-study position, and secured a paid internship for the summer in his field of interest, and had even saved enough from his campus job to contribute money toward his next year's expenses without being asked. More than that, he spoke about his friends and classmates with a new understanding of different life circumstances, showing empathy for students who were struggling even more than he was, and disdain for those whose parental safety nets had left them entitled and unprepared for real challenges. "I used to think I had it hard," he told me one evening over dinner. "But then I met people who are literally supporting family members while going to school, who are working 2 jobs and still taking full course loads, who don't have anyone to call when things get tough. It made me realize how lucky I actually am to have you, and to have had the childhood I had, even if it wasn't the wealthiest one." Now, as I'm writing this with Ethan in his junior year at Ashford, doing well academically and growing into a person I'm genuinely proud to know, I think about that moment in the kitchen when he told me I owed him everything, and I agreed with him. I think about how counterintuitive my response must have seemed to anyone on the outside, how it looked like I was giving in or enabling bad behavior when I was actually doing the opposite. By letting him believe I owed him everything, I was setting the stage to teach him what I actually owed him and what I didn't, what he was entitled to as my child, and what he needed to earn himself as an adult. The distinction was one he had never been forced to consider before, and making him consider it was one of the hardest and most loving things I've ever done as a parent. I won't claim I did everything right in raising Ethan. There were countless mistakes along the way, and many things I would do differently if I could go back with the wisdom I have now. I probably should have introduced concepts of financial reality and gratitude much earlier. Should have been more willing to let him struggle with small disappointments so that the big ones wouldn't hit so hard. Should have prioritized teaching character as much as I prioritized providing opportunities. But I also know that I did the best I could with the understanding and resources I had at each moment. And when I finally recognized that something fundamental needed to change, I found the courage to change it, even when it was painful and uncertain. The relationship I have with Ethan now is different from what it was during his high school years, and honestly, it's better. Built on more honest foundation where he sees me as a whole person rather than just a resource, where I see him as an adult I'm helping launch, rather than a child I'm responsible for protecting from every hardship. We talk about money openly now, about career choices and student loan repayment plans, and what the future might look like. He asks for my advice sometimes, but he doesn't expect me to solve his problems. And the gratitude he expresses for what I have done and continue to do feels genuine, because it comes from someone who now understands what sacrifice actually means. There are still moments of tension, still times when old patterns try to reassert themselves. When he gets stressed and wants me to swoop in and fix things, or when I feel the old guilt creeping in about not doing more, not being more, not providing more. But we've established new patterns too, healthier ones where boundaries exist, and responsibility is clear, and love is expressed through honest communication, rather than through me depleting myself to fill what sometimes felt like a bottomless well of need. I'm learning that it's possible to love someone completely while also maintaining my own separate identity and needs. That being a good mother doesn't require martyrdom. That the best gift I can give my child is not a life without challenges, but the tools and character to face challenges successfully. Looking back on that pivotal conversation in the kitchen, I realize now that Ethan was right in ways neither of us understood in that moment. I did owe him everything, just not the everything he thought he meant. I owed him honesty about what life actually costs and requires. I owed him the chance to develop his own strength by carrying his own weight. I owed him boundaries that would help him understand where my responsibility ended and his began. I owed him the gift of struggle that would teach him competence and resilience. I owed him the opportunity to become someone who valued what he had because he had worked for it, rather than someone who took everything for granted because it had always appeared effortlessly. By letting him believe that I owed him everything he wanted, I was able to redirect the conversation toward teaching him everything he actually needed. If you're reading this and you see yourself in my story, whether as a parent who has been sacrificing beyond what is healthy or sustainable, or as someone who maybe took their own parents' efforts for granted for too long, I want you to know that it's never too late to change the dynamic, to have hard conversations, to establish new patterns. It won't be easy, and it won't be comfortable, and there will be moments when you question whether you're doing the right thing. But authentic relationships built on honesty and mutual respect are worth the discomfort of getting there. Your children don't need you to destroy yourself for them. They need you to show them how to build themselves up. They don't need you to shield them from every difficulty. They need you to believe they're capable of overcoming difficulty. They don't need you to owe them everything. They need you to teach them that they owe themselves the effort to become their best selves. And if you're on the other side of this dynamic, if you're the child who has been taking more than they realized or expecting more than is fair, I want you to know that recognizing this doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you someone capable of growth and change. The fact that you've read this far suggests you're already thinking about these dynamics in a new way, already questioning patterns that maybe you've fallen into without examining them too closely. It's okay to have needed support growing up. That's what parents are for. But part of growing up is recognizing the cost of that support and developing gratitude for it, and eventually finding ways to stand on your own feet so that the people who raised you can finally tend to their own lives and needs. The truth is that parenthood is an impossible balance of holding on and letting go, of providing and teaching to provide for themselves, of loving so much you want to shield them from every pain while knowing that some pain is necessary for growth. There's no perfect formula, and no one gets it completely right, and the best we can do is remain open to learning, to changing our approach when something isn't working, to having the hard conversations even when avoidance would be easier. When Ethan told me I owed him everything, he was really asking me a question he didn't know how to articulate. He was asking what our relationship was actually built on, what he could count on from me, what his place in my life and the world actually was. And by letting him believe his interpretation for a moment, before systematically dismantling it and rebuilding something healthier, I was finally answering that question honestly. So yes, I let my son believe I owed him everything, and then I taught him what that actually meant, and in doing so, I gave him the most valuable thing I could offer. Not the college of his dreams, or the life without struggle, or the future handed to him on a silver platter, but the strength and capability and character to build whatever life he chooses for himself. That's what I actually owed him all along, and I'm grateful that I figured it out before it was too late, before I had sacrificed so much of myself that there was nothing left, before he had been so protected from reality that he couldn't function within it. The journey from that kitchen conversation to where we are now has been difficult and messy and full of moments of doubt, but I wouldn't change it because it brought us both to a better place, a more authentic place, a place where love looks like honesty and support, looks like boundaries, and family looks like people who respect each other as individuals rather than roles. If this story resonated with you, if you've been in a similar situation either as a parent struggling with boundaries or as someone who has taken their parents for granted, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter, and we all learn from sharing our experiences with each other. Have you had to make difficult choices about how much to sacrifice for your children, or had a wake-up call about how you've treated the people who supported you? Hit that subscribe button if you want to follow along for more honest discussions about family dynamics and parenting and the complicated reality of relationships. And give this a like if you appreciate the vulnerability of sharing these difficult truths, because your engagement helps these stories reach other people who might need to hear them. Remember that it's never too late to change patterns that aren't serving anyone well, that hard conversations are often the ones we need most, and that real love sometimes looks like disappointing someone in the short term to help them become stronger in the long term. Thank you for reading this far, and for being part of a community that values authentic discussion about the messy reality of raising humans and being raised by them.